All right, so nobody liked my joke a minute ago when I said we were going to have a greasy conversation.
Carl loved it.
So if somebody could please deal with the front light so you guys can see this more clearly, we'll have our discussion. Somebody needs to set their timer for 14 minutes so that I do not talk past that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with, you can turn, yeah, there you go. So I'm going to start with just a kind of a prelude to this thing, okay? Greece is your heritage. Well, let me say, Greece is America's heritage, okay? The first two cultures that we talked about, or the first two large-scale cultures that we talked about were African and Asian. Greece is where Western thought came out of. Democracy came out of Greece. Much of the way that we view the world comes out of Greece. Very, very different than the sort of Asian perspective on the world. And so I just want you guys to kind of be aware of that. Continuing with my little sort of desire to get you guys to kind of see how things are interrelated, right? We've gone back to the Dymaxion globe that you guys once built, right? And we go back to that notion of being able to identify the continents and where they divide up. And we see here that we have, in fact, one of these cultures in Africa, one of these cultures in Asia, because remember, Asia comes to, I'm looking at the tool to make sure I get the Bosphorus correct, to here, okay? And Europe goes from there over, okay? So these things, these divisions are more than just plate tectonic or geographic, they're cultural, okay? So, all right, at any rate, so Greece is not far, relatively speaking, to the whole world from neither Mesopotamia nor Egypt. It's relatively close, just across the water. Big body of water, but it's across the water, okay? Oops, went the wrong way. Another view, sort of tying it back to around Earth, okay? You can start to get an idea of where these different pieces are. Remember, Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and the Mediterranean, okay? So by sailing across the Mediterranean at one of its shortest points, you can go from Europe to Africa, and that's exactly where Egypt was. One of the things that you'll see as we sort of progress through this thing is that these cultures, while they don't have the internet and they don't have modern communications, did have interrelationships, okay? A little bit more close-up view, you guys can start to see that the Greek mainland and the Greek Isles can access the African continent across a relatively short sort of sea journey, and that there is literally a land bridge from most of the Greek Isles across through where modern Turkey is to where Mesopotamia was. Okay. It's important to note that these cultures existed at similar times. This is a really generalized timeline that I threw together this morning. Yeah. Okay, but you can start to see this includes all of the pre-dynastic periods for Egypt and the really early Sumerian stuff, okay? But you can see that these cultures all existed during the same time period, and you can see that, you know, they all sort of, they run up against this thing called Rome, okay? They all, they don't all have the same conquest date, but they all run up against that Roman conquest. And so, again, the intent of this is that you see that, hey, you know what? From 3000 BCE until the Roman conquest, all three of these cultures were firing on all cylinders. They were all there. Taking a closer look at Greek periods, there is above an overall timeline of all of the Greek periods, including the periods past the Roman occupation or the Roman absorption, okay? And then there's an inset that talks about the pre-Greek, which is what this lecture is about, civilizations, which include, and I'm gonna, hopefully I don't butcher this, the Cycladic, the C pronounced as a S, right? The Minoan and the Mycenaean, okay? So to take a look at where those pieces, so I'm gonna back up for a second. So take a look at that, right? And then I'm gonna go forward to this, okay? So if we take a look at where these three sort of pre-Greek civilizations occurred at different times, we see that the Cycladic civilization occurred in the Greek Isles, okay? The Minoan civilization occurred on the island of Crete. That's this big, long, skinny island here at the bottom, okay? And the Mycenaean civilization occurred on the Greek mainland and on the peninsulas around it. All of these cultures essentially over millennia melded together and produced the final classical Greek culture, the one that we get the classical temples from and the classical Greek architecture from. Okay. Another view of some of the cities for which there is proof of existence. Up until a certain point, people thought that the Iliad by Homer was writing a fiction, right? Until somebody went along, he had a German name, I forgot the name, but it's a German guy, right? I think he's German, he could be Austrian, who knows? He actually discovered Troy, all right? So were any of you required to read the Iliad in high school?
No.
A couple of you? What? The movie. Was Donald Trump in it? No. Okay, anyway, so continuing on. Of those cultures, so I'll back up for just a moment, right? There's two cultures that existed early on, so we'll go back to the little timeline. So the Cycladic culture existed over the broad range of time, right, up to what they call the Greek Dark Ages. But they did not produce a substantial architecture. So our focus then changes to Minoan and Mycenaean cultures, who did produce substantial architecture. Okay, so back forward to where we were. The first of these cultures that produced a viable architecture and a very advanced architecture and advanced sciences and stuff is the Minoans. And the Minoans, as I mentioned a moment ago, essentially developed on the Isle of Crete. All right, so you can get an idea of where it is in regards to the Greek Isles and the Greek mainland. There's a view of it from Google Earth that kind of shows that it looks like somebody pulled two pieces of bread apart and there's a bunch of crumbs between them, right? Sort of like a little island sprinkled between Turkey and Greece. No comments, Batul? No, okay, she's tired. Okay, so now let's get on to some wordy stuff, shall we? All right, so the Minoans were a great Bronze Age civilization with an affluent upper class. The key thing to understand here is that these guys were advanced. They were advanced beyond the other cultures that were existing around them. They took stuff from other cultures and made it better. Okay, these people traveled to Egypt, these people traveled to portions of Mesopotamia, and they brought back with them things, including knowledge and technologies. One of the key things to know about the Minoans is that they lived on an island, right? So that kind of equates pretty easily in people's minds with the fact that they were seafaring. They were sailors, my kind of people. They weren't pirates, though, so I'll hold that against them. They developed the first written language of Europe. Remember, we said that the first written language, as far as we know, was in Mesopotamia. The cuneiform, the little weird, like arrowhead-looking things. But these guys developed the first written language in Europe, and it predates, anything else in the European continent. They had extensive sea routes for trading, okay? And they had a road system. They had administrative sort of leadership. So it wasn't just some king, right? Most of the culture was run in what is called a city-state. That is, that it wasn't one unified Crete, right? It was several city-states that shared the culture, and there was leadership within each state, but they sort of worked together. All right? So one of the things about the Minoans and their architecture is that they built multi-story complexes. I mean, like buildings that by today's standards would be considered, a high-rise, something over 3 or 4 stories. All right? So one of the key things that they built that we found remains of, that they put a lot of time into, is palatial architecture, palaces. And we think of palaces as being a place where the king lives, right? But in the case of the Minoans, the palaces were very large, and there were a lot of people that lived there, and there were a lot of functions that took place there. It wasn't just the king's palace. Okay. One of the things about them is that they lived, like us in California, in a seismic zone. Okay. And one of the things that they did is that they used wood, right, as a means of taking some sort of axial and bending stress that something like stone can't take, as a means of bracing their buildings against the earthquakes that would regularly come through there. As I mentioned a little bit ago, some of the palaces were distribution centers for goods, and so like trading routes and stuff would end up at these palaces, and that's where a lot of the goods would end up, maybe either by tax or other means, and then that stuff would then get distributed out from the palace. It was important to note that these guys actually had running water. Yeah, they had a water system, okay? They had drainage systems. They knew how to capture rainwater, okay? So think about another difference, right? The two civilizations that we've talked about previous to this, both sort of centered around a river valley. Crete is an island in the middle of a salt sea. All right, and while it does have fresh water, it's not like it has this massive alluvial plain flooding with water all the time. And so I think that it's important to note that that's a pretty impressive thing, that they could capture water and somehow retain it. One of the things that is theorized is that the end of the Minoan civilization occurred because of massive seismic activity. For some reason, these extremely advanced people disappeared over a very short period of time. There's a note here that says civilization was overrun by Mycenaeans. I probably should change that to absorbed by Mycenaeans. Okay. Continuing on with more wordy stuff. All right. Where are we at on time?
Oh, shit. Yeah, we should stop right now.
Oh, you guys are killing me. I had to.
It's gonna go off at 14:30.
All right, I'm gonna stop it.